Hi everyone, I am Disco, and for today's session, we will be talking about how to analyze the early game and how you want to think about it. And in extension, we're going to also talk about how that will help you navigate your mid game well. The concepts that we're going to talk are going to be generally applicable and some very specific use cases, largely because the way in which we think about early and mid game doesn't often end up being this exact same as how we think about late game. The late game, in my opinion, is one of the least interesting things to talk about when it comes to TFT, mostly because comps are so solved in TFT due to stats, due to net decking, etc., whatever you want to call it, that often enough in your end game past stage 4 or 4-2 onwards, or if you're going fast 9, regardless, whatever the case, you will not be playing different boards very often, right? In 99% of your games, the boards that you will be playing will just be the most optimal boards that have been, hard fought through millions and millions of games, and we now know to be the best variations of certain boards, right? So you won't really have any flexible units. You will have units set in stone. The early and mid game is not that at all, right? So that's why I think that early and mid game is like by far A, the most interesting to talk about, but B, also the hardest to solve, right? Any idiot can find the 4-2 comp, plug the units in, and then put them on their board, come 4-2 on their roll down. It's how you get there that is going to make a lot of difference in your placements in your games. So, getting into it, first, let's of course start with stage 2. Like I already mentioned, stage 2 board strength is, I didn't mention, but stage 2 board strength is the easiest to analyze, mostly because the amount of variables that are in play is going to be the least, right? In the entire game of TFT. At the very onset, you're going to have only 3 units and 3 components in most of your games, with like wiggle room here and there, depending on, the items dropped, etc., augments, blah, blah, blah. But generally, the amount of variables are going to be the least to analyze, right? This allows us to be able to make very confident decisions in terms of how we want to approach our stage 2, right? And of course, the two main options that we have at the beginning of stage 2, and the most key decision to make, this is where a lot of placements are often won or lost, is just this one singular decision, which is whether we want to win streak or whether we want to lose streak, right? This decision itself is going to be meta dependent, believe it or not, right? Because, and when I say meta dependent, what I mean is dependent on the comps that are most viable in the late game. Now, you can ask, how is that affecting our decision on stage 2? Well, the difference becomes in whether or not a meta is dictated by 1 or 2 dominant comps versus not. So, what do we mean by this? What we mean by this is whenever there's a case where there is a dominant or 2 dominant comps in the meta, often enough, a large amount of the lobby wants to play towards that comp. When that is the case, full open strategies become significantly more viable. Why do they become more viable? They become the most viable because A, full open heavily optimizes for econ at the sacrifice of HP. Secondly, it also optimizes for item quality, right? Which means that when you are playing full econ, you will be at a big deficit when it comes to your HP, meaning that come stage 4, if you are not able to stabilize, very often you'll go 8th, right? But if there is a dominant comp in the meta, it allows you to play in such a way and actually get away with it, because on stage 4, if you are able to transition your board fully with item economy being way stronger on account of you'll be getting the desired items and being able to slam base. So for example, if you were playing Corki last patch, then being able to slam Deathblade and Last Whisper every single game, or like the patch before, if you were playing, say, Master Yi, you could guarantee having Edge of Night, QSS, stuff like that, right? In every single game. And some of these carries do end up being heavily item dependent. There's 1 or 2 items that heavily enable them. Case in point, Corki, or being Deathblade, Master Yi being Edge of Night. So in these cases, a full open strategy becomes far more viable because we're able to stabilize and actually win out. When this is not the case, the decision becomes a little bit more complicated, because suddenly, if you were to full open and fully sacrifice your HP, maybe on stage 4 you roll it down, but you're not actually able to stabilize so well, because there's not one singular comp that is head and shoulders above the other comps that you will be able to hit guaranteed, even if you have an econ lead, right? So you might hit your main comp, but the fact that a large part of the lobby is not playing that comp means that they will also be able to hit their comps, because they're not just playing the most dominant comp, meaning you won't be punishing other people in the lobby. But B, also, those comps will have relative strength as well. And if these people have conserved their HP, they don't need to play as, do or die on stage 4. That means eventually they can sack a few rounds on stage 4, but eventually outscale you come stage 5 when they're able to go 9, but you have to send it all the way to 0. Okay. All of this was to say that the meta does actually really tangibly affect our decision whether or not we want to play for a lose or win streak on stage 2. Now, what this means is, how do we decide whether or not we want to play for a win streak? Well, this is actually one of the easier things to be able to quantify, right? Which is to say, if we have upgrades and if we have slammable items for said upgrades, then playing for a win streak is often a good idea. Of course, this also ties into augments, in which when you have a tempo augment, say, let's just say that you have something like build a bud, which immediately gives you a 3-star 1 cost, then of course that's also going to be maximizing tempo and you are going to be playing for a win streak, etc. So over there, the decision actually becomes easy. Now, what is often misunderstood is the concept of a mixed streak, right? A lot of people seem to think that either you play for a full open lose streak and try to stabilize late, or you just play full tempo for a win streak and try to go from there. However, mixed streak doesn't actually end up being as bad as it is often thought to be. But I say that with an asterisk, right? Because this is also a little bit meta dependent. Mixed streak in a meta where a lot of people are trying to play for full open ends up being much more valuable. The reason for this is often enough you're in a mixed streak position when you have a decent enough board, but you don't feel confident enough to level. And then you're kind of stuck in this middle where you're like win, loss, win, loss, win, loss, that kind of situation. Yuck, don't want to be there. However, if you see that multiple people are going for a full open strategy, but you don't actually want to contest the dominant comp in the meta either, and you actually have items for something else entirely, that's when a mixed streak isn't really that bad, because what that enables you to do is hold on to your units that you want to hold. Let's say you were thinking of playing a Lulu reroll game in a meta that is called key dominant. Well, you get to hold your Lulus. You get to win over all the people who were trying to full open. So you'll get, like, let's say 3 wins on stage 2. But at the same time, you'll also not have leveled on to 1. So you are making the necessary econ breakpoints regardless, which gives you a certain edge. Now, going a little bit more in depth about these concepts for when we want to apply them to win streaking, right? How do we want to, and not just win streaking, but this also applies to just trying to preserve HP, or playing the strongest board is the easiest way to learn about it, right? Or think about it rather. Some items are going to be early game items, and some items are going to be late game items. Now, this seems a little bit, I guess, counterintuitive on account of, well, all items are used late game as well, right? So often enough, the comp that you are dictated is based off of what items you slammed early. If you slammed a Rage Blade, then you'll be playing a Rage Blade carry, so on and so forth. What I'm trying to say over here is that TFT as a game incentivizes you to slam certain items earlier in the game because their maximum value, or rather, maximum value is not the right way to put it, but their power budget is put into flat numbers, whereas other items' power budget is put into multiplicativeness, right? So what we mean by that is, a very simple example can be an item, and this I mean, just to be clear, this used to be a lot more prevalent before they reworked the items. Now they've made it such that in TFT a lot of the items do synergize with each other and scale off of each other, and the flat items are not nearly as prevalent in the game. But think back to when there were items like Runans, Hurricanes, or Static Shiv, etc., when we were playing back, which had a lot of flat damage on them. Because it was flat damage, early game, they were actually really, really strong, because early game units just don't have that much HP or resistances, where flat damage becomes that much better. Whereas late game, they tended to fall off, right? Now, this still applies a little bit to certain items more than others, and we're going to talk about those ones, right? So, for example, if you have, let's say, the option, you open an item anvil on 2-1, and you have the option, and you know that you're playing AP this game, right? And now you have the decision whether you want to take a Void Staff or you want to take a Morello. We know that towards the end of the game, you want to end up in a situation where you have both anti-heal and you have some form of Shred/Thunder based on whatever comp you're playing, right? So over here, it would seem that both are almost equally good. But this is not the case at all. Why is this not the case? The reason this is not the case is, early game, most people only have 1 or at most 2 items on their main tank, right? Sometimes even 0 if they've tried to itemize their carry early on. So that means that their main tank will not have that many resistances that you want to get through. In late game, when there is a unit which is a main tank and that has, like, let's say gargoyles, warmogs, and it's a single frontline unit, it's going to have so much MR that 30% of shedding that is actually worth a lot. Whereas early game, if it's just a random, hodgepodge of units where you're playing a Mordekaiser, Leona, blah blah blah, random frontline, and you have a Zoe in the back with Morello, there's not much to get through. Whereas Morello, that's going to be applicable regardless, because it's going to be dealing damage over time early game. And early game fights often end up lasting for a really, really long time for the exact reason that most units don't have this kind of damage yet, which is a concept that we're going to touch again on in the next slide. But for now, what items should we be slamming? Well, a little bit forwarding, tank items are generally a little bit better in the early game, but we'll get to that in a sec. Now, first, I just want to talk about the item economy a little bit, because what we're going to talk about in the next slide is going to incentivize you to slam tank items in your early and mid game. However, one thing to note is in modern TFT, with the amount of resources that have been added to the game and the amount of just raw items that you actually end up getting, it used to be that towards the end of stage 4, you wanted to aim towards having a fully itemized tank and a fully itemized carry. But the game has evolved in such a way that it has really, like, the power creep has really settled in to where now what you're generally aiming for is one fully itemized tank and two fully itemized carries. We can look at different comps, like, for example, the comps that we brought up earlier, whether you look at Corki Ramus as an example, where your main tank is going to be your Ramus, and then you want Corki and Driven itemized as your carries. Or if you look at Master Yi, a similar concept applies, where you want Tom Kench fully itemized as your tank, and then you want both Kindred and Master Yi with 3 items as well, so 2 carries. So in general, if you want to make sure that your item economy doesn't get messed up later on, it is fair to keep as a rule of thumb an idea that, okay, I want to keep an item economy somewhat geared towards a 2:1 ratio the entirety of the game. Right now, of course, there's going to be exceptions to this case, and sometimes you're going to want to, like, adjust this based on the components you're taking, right? So for example, tier is a very good component to take, which can allow you to have a kind of hedge between frontline and backline, because it can often be a backline item in your blue buff and Trojan, but in a pinch, it can also serve very clearly as a frontline item, because it can become Protector's Vow, it can become your Spirit Visage, it can become adaptive, so stuff like that. Now, why are tank items? I mentioned this earlier, but let's actually talk about it. Why are tank items better in the early game? The concept of this is as such that, generally speaking, tanks in the early game are going to be much better because damage resources are not nearly as prevalent to where the units can burst right through them. What does this mean? What this means is when you look at the late game team fights, often enough, the carries are doing so much damage that this is the exact reason, right? Like late game, there are so many stabilizing points that you finally reach that your carries are so enabled by that you have Biss on your main carry. So for example, an item specific carry like Corki having Deathblade or a Master Yi having Edge of Night, versus or even like late game carries of AP, right? So an Aurelian Sol, a Bard, stuff like this can really rip through enemy front lines, and the fights end up being significantly shorter. This is also why in the late game we see that it is much more useful to have 2 fully itemized carries as opposed to having 2 fully itemized tanks, for this exact same reason. One tank is generally enough to stave this off, and having 2 fully itemized cannons going at the back is more favorable. Now, this concept, because of these reasons, kind of flips in the early and mid game. So we can think about this in 2 ways. Now, one of them is that if you think about what items you want to slam and what comp you're going to play, well, flexibility is a very useful thing when it comes to slamming tank items in a good meta, right? If it's an open meta where items are very specific for your carries and such, then the concept is obviously not applicable. But generally speaking, if you're playing good TFT, then slamming tank items is never ever going to be bad for you, on account of tanks generally use almost the same items, and you can get away with having, like, there's no unit that you're going to slam Bramble, Declaw, Warmogs on, and late game it's going to be bad, right? Generally, tanks are going to be fine having that kind of itemization, whereas carries generally require far more specific items. So the flexibility in the early mid game is definitely much more favorable. They also scale very well early, and not just that. Like when you think about a Leona 1, or even a Leona 2, or not even a Leona 3, but a Leona 2 in the last patch. You think about a Leona 2 in the mid game with 3 full items in the front line, nobody is getting through that, right? No early game unit actually has enough DPS to be able to burst through that unit. This is generally because the early game units that we're going to be itemizing to pivot into our later game are just not designed in a way that they can pump out enough damage, right? And even in the cases that they can, it's going to be rare enough that the opponent will have enough frontline to go along with it, right? So, for example, if they have fully itemized a 3-item Ezreal versus I have a 3-item Leona, the fight is going to end up a lot more favorably for me because they don't have enough frontline. They'll have spent all their item economy itemizing in a backline unit without any frontline to support it. Whereas if I have just a Leona 2 with 3 items, with just a Zoe 1 with a Morello in the back, we've all seen how that goes, right? Leona can provide enough attrition to where Zoe will actually end up killing a lot of units that where you won't even have bad losses. So this also goes into preserving HP, which is if you have a fully itemized carry very, very early on, but a very weak frontline, often enough the enemy boards will be able to just get through it and get to your backline and deal enough damage, right? So you will be losing the fight, but you won't kill enough units either to where you're preserving a lot of HP. You'll actually be killing like 1 or 2 units at max because these backline carries actually need frontline to be able to pump out enough damage to kill units and save HP. Whereas if you just have a fully itemized tank, that's not going to be the case. You're going to get away with killing a lot more units. With this concept in mind, how do we actually deal with this if there is like such a meta that already existed with the Leona stacking and multiple people trying to play this way? Well, the easiest method is to actually just bypass the carrier. Like, so units like Talon actually work very, very well in against this kind of attrition strategy, to where they can just ignore the frontline Leona. And similarly, Zoe is also a good example of this kind of strategy where only one of the procs of her ultimate will actually be hitting the Leona, and you'll actually kill the rest of the board, and Leona will often be the last man standing. Or you can get a kind of stacking carry, something like Teemo, which really pumps damage onto one carry and stacks over the course of the fight. However, it's not very consistent, especially when the meta emerges as that the kind of tanks that we're talking about are as dominant as they are. And because of the way that we talked about, stacking one carry is going to be a lot more suspicious of a strategy against other boards, right? Okay, that's about itemization. At this point, we're also thinking about balancing our board, right? So we want to have enough frontline and backline to where our board can actually sustain in good fights, right? And this is where stage 3 we really need to start thinking about item economy. We talked about the ratio that we want to maintain beforehand, and what we can think about when like this is mostly applicable when we're thinking about what items to slam, what god boons to pick, and what augments to pick on stage 3. Because in this case, we don't want to end up in a situation that, okay, we followed what Disco was talking about and we built a really good tank, but we just lost out every fight because we didn't end up having any damage, right? In those cases, having a Morello in the backline or having at least some kind of damage is going to be very, very worthwhile. And you're going to need to generally pull for both buckets to be able to actually have a solid mid-game board. One thing that I do want to now extrapolate from what we just talked about is effective HP becomes very, very strong in the mid-game. What does this mean? What do I mean by this? Well, a concept that we briefly talked about right now was the fact that in the early and mid game, carries don't have enough damage to quickly burst through units, right? The damage in general is very low. The fights are long. This is why Rage Blade is really good early. This is why Archangels is really good early, stuff like that, right? Longer fights. Longer fights happen because damage is low, right? So, why does this make effective HP really strong? Well, sustain. Sustain is actually the king of mid game. If you think about the fact that burst units cannot simply burst through, or rather carries cannot simply burst through your units in the early and mid game, what that means is that gives enough time for your main tank or even melee carries to take some damage and then heal back up, meaning that the damage that the opponent's carries just did ends up being completely irrelevant, right? So stage 3 and even in stage 4, before people end up hitting their 2-star carries, is where sustain thrives. This is part of the reason that the Master Yi comp is so good on stage 4 and stabilizes so hard, because often enough, the damage is just simply not there for units to be able to burst through this Master Yi or like these Marauders and these Brawlers, right? Let's think about a mid-game carry
which is taking a lot of damage. So in this case, we can easily think about this concept through the example of Belveth, right? A Belveth, or even Briar, when Briar was actually strong about 2 patches or 3 patches ago. A lot of times, what would happen is Briar would take some damage and then heal right back up very, very quickly. And all of the damage that was actually done to Briar would end up being completely irrelevant because no unit can actually burst through this. Tanks also are really good at abusing this idea. And there are certain tank items that also incentivize this. So rather than having flat items like Steadfast Heart or Gargoyles, in the mid game, tanks that are able to leverage this concept end up doing really well. And these are tanks that either have inbuilt healing on their kit or can abuse healing items, aka Spirit Visage or what's it called? Declaw. Either of these items that provide percentage based healing are going to be really good in the mid game. What we can do from this is build a game plan that is predicated upon having sustain and attrition as a game plan, right? When we say attrition, of course, we mean a game plan that has inevitability in a long fight as its win condition. A unit with Morello that spreads it to the entire board, because of its very nature of the item, will eventually end up killing the entire board. Similarly, a comp like Timo Reroll is predicated around this kind of attrition game plan where you have one main tank, which is the Leona, that often would just get so much HP and attrition, backed by a Rageblade carry that and exactly a Morello with applied onto a Zoe that would put it on the entire board. And then eventually, that's why those comps would really dominate when they were strong in the mid game and stabilize so hard on like stage 5, on even level 5, is because the game plan fundamentally is just very solid and abuses these core mechanics of TFT. This doesn't apply to just this side. These are very core fundamental ideas that are built on like TFT as a game. And unless Riot fundamentally changes how many resources are available to you in the early and the mid game, especially in terms of items, these concepts will stand the test of time. Now, again, if you want to bypass this kind of game plan of sustaining thriving, then you need to kind of build around a bypass again, right? Often enough, the cases in which you would see these kind of Briar comps lose in is when Talon would just kill every single unit beforehand. But even in that case, we're all familiar with those fights where someone hits a Master Yi early and you end up killing every single other unit, but the Master Yi is just unkillable because 3 item Master Yi on stage 3 is just sustaining back up again and again, and you can never actually kill it. You deal a lot of damage, and you see the damage charts and damage blocked, and at the end of the fight, Master Yi somehow has blocked like 5,000 damage. That's kind of the concept that I'm talking about in the mid game, and why sustain is very much the king of mid game. The reason I spent so much time talking about this is because these concepts are not very often talked about, right? We don't actually talk about what items are broken in the mid game and the early game and what concepts are good that like really fall off late game, right? Like sustained late game is not nearly as good because the fights are much shorter. And true, right? We've all been in the situation that Mastery gets to the backline, gets a successful wrap off, but still just gets one shot by an Aurelian Sol or something. Which is why I just wanted to touch upon these concepts a little bit. I hope that it's something that was unique, something that maybe you haven't thought about yet in your early and mid games that will help you in your game plans later on. But yeah, any questions?